In the fall of 1978, in the narrowest part of the Matanuska Valley, Silas Blackwood spent his entire inheritance on 35 draft horses and was declared a fool. The declaration wasn't official, not recorded in the Palmer courthouse, but it was passed over coffee at the Roadhouse and confirmed in the feed aisle of the co-op. It was a consensus built on the unassailable logic of progress. Then, with those same horses, he found the 3 acres of land nobody knew were there. Let me tell you about the inheritance, because that is where the story begins. It wasn't a vast sum. Silas's father, Abram Blackwood, had worked the same 157 acres for 52 of his 74 years, and the farm had a way of consuming wealth as surely as it consumed sunlight and water. When Abram passed in May of 1978, he left behind the land, the house, the barn, a collection of aging machinery, and a savings account at the First National Bank of Anchorage. The account held $42,311.58, not a penny more. In his will, a single page typed on an old Underwood, and witnessed by his neighbor, Abram had been clear. The land and buildings went to Silas, his only child, with the expectation that he would work it. The cash was his to do with as he saw fit, though the final line of the will read, "Buy what the land needs, not what the salesman wants." Silas Blackwood was 61 years old. He had worked this land alongside his father since he was old enough to carry a bucket. He was known for 2 things: his silence and the way he could stand in a field and seem to be listening to it. He was a small man, wiry and weathered, with hands that were more callous than skin. His posture was permanently stooped, a question mark carved by decades of labor. He wore the same outfit every day that wasn't a Sunday: denim overalls, a gray wool shirt, and work boots that had been resoled 4 times. The farm itself was a difficult piece of ground pressed against the Chugach Mountains. The soil was a temperamental mix of glacial silt, volcanic loam, and dense clay deposits that could turn from concrete to soup in a single spring melt. The official survey, conducted in 1946, listed it at 157.6 acres. But Abram had always said the number was a guess made by a man in a hurry. For 2 generations the Blackwoods had coaxed barley and potatoes from it. They paid their bills, they kept the barn roof from leaking, and they passed the land down. It was a living, but it was a hard one, and it was getting harder. The pressure came from all sides. The cost of fertilizer was tied to the price of oil. The new hybrid seeds promised higher yields, but required more inputs and couldn't be saved year to year. The consensus in the valley, the story told in the bank, and at the equipment dealership was that the only way to survive was to get bigger, more efficient, and more powerful. The era of the 100-horsepower tractor was over. To make a living on 150 acres, you needed scale, you needed debt, you needed horsepower. This is why, 3 weeks after Silas buried his father, a brand-new Ford pickup truck gleaming cherry red. The man who stepped out was Frank Miller. Frank was 28 years old, had a degree in agricultural economics from Purdue University, and had been the top salesman for the John Deere dealership in Palmer for the last 3 years running. He was known for his firm handshake, his perfect white teeth, and his unshakable belief in the power of data. He carried a leather-bound binder filled with amortization tables. He was not a villain. He was a true believer in the gospel of modern efficiency, and he was here to save Silas Blackwood from himself. He met Silas by the old barn. The air smelled of hay and damp earth. Frank offered a hand. Blackwood. Frank Miller. I am so sorry for your loss. Your father was a pillar of this community. Silas nodded. He did not take the hand. He was holding a worn leather harness, running a thumb over a cracked strap. The leather was dark with the sweat of horses that had died 30 years ago. Frank was undeterred. He gestured to the fields. Abram was a great farmer, one of the best, but the methods are changing. The economics are changing. To honor his legacy, you have to adapt. You have to modernize. He opened his binder on the hood of his truck. The pages were clean, laminated. I'm here to talk to you about the 8630. The John Deere 8630 was, in 1978, a monument of agricultural engineering. An articulated four-wheel drive tractor that weighed over 20,000 pounds. Its diesel engine produced 275 horsepower at the drawbar. It could pull a 12-bottom plow through heavy clay soil without a tremble. It came with an enclosed, air-conditioned cab with a radio. It was the future, and it had a price tag to match, $78,500. I know what you're thinking, Frank said, flipping to a page of charts. It's a big number, but let's not look at the price. Let's look at the investment. Let's look at the return. His finger tapped a column of figures. Your current setup, with that old case tractor of yours, you're plowing what, 2 acres an hour? On a good day, the 8630 will do 7. We're talking about turning a 3-week job into a 4-day job. Look at the fuel consumption per acre. It's 18% lower than your case. Look at the compaction. The 4-wheel design distributes the weight. You get less soil compaction, better water penetration, higher germination rates. We're projecting a 12 to 15% yield increase in the first year alone. He used phrases like capital expenditure, depreciation schedule, and 5-year profitability outlook. He explained how the bank had already pre-approved a loan for Silas. A 20% down payment just over $15,000, and the rest financed over 10 years at 9.75% interest. With the increased yield and the fuel savings, Frank concluded, his voice ringing with sincerity, the machine pays for itself. It's not an expense, Silas. It's a profit center. Through it all, Silas said nothing. He just stood there, working a cloth soaked in linseed oil into the old leather. His nephew, Leo, had come out of the house to listen. Leo was 22, strong and eager, but he had grown up hearing his grandfather Abram complain about the price of diesel and the cost of a new transmission. He saw the logic in Frank's numbers. He saw the gleaming, powerful machine in the brochure Frank held out. He saw a future that wasn't defined by 16-hour days and aching backs. He's right, Uncle Silas, Leo said softly. Granddad was always fixing that old case. It costs us a week every spring, Frank smiled, sensing an ally. The boy understands. This isn't about working harder. It's about working smarter. Silas finally looked up. He looked past Frank, past the shiny truck, and looked at the mountain. The peak of Pioneer Peak was sharp against the blue sky. He had looked at that mountain every day of his life. He knew its moods, the way the snow line crept down in the fall, the way the rock faces caught the morning sun. His father had taught him to read the weather by the clouds that formed around its summit. The mountain was not on Frank's charts. He spoke, his voice raspy from disuse. He said, "The land needs to breathe." Frank's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Less compaction means the soil breathes better. Better aeration. Silas shook his head. Not the soil. The land. He held up the old harness. A machine knows speed. It doesn't know the ground. Frank closed his binder. He was a professional. He knew when to push and when to retreat. "Okay, Silas, I understand. It's a big decision. It's a lot to take in right after everything. Why don't you think about it? The offer from the bank is good for 30 days. Here's my card." He handed the card to Leo. "You talk it over with your nephew. I'll check back in a week." As the red truck disappeared down the driveway, leaving a cloud of dust, Leo turned to his uncle. "A machine doesn't know the ground. It's a tool. You tell it where to go." Silas coiled the harness and hung it on a wooden peg inside the barn door. The peg had been there since his grandfather, Hezekiah Blackwood, had built the barn in 1921. Hezekiah had come from North Dakota, and he had come with 2 teams of Percheron horses. The pegs were worn into smooth, dark valleys from the weight of harnesses. He finally answered Leo. "A tractor follows a map. A horse follows the earth. Let me tell you about the decision, because it was not made quickly." For 3 weeks, Silas was a ghost on his own farm. He walked the fence lines. He crumbled dirt in his hands. He sat in the barn on an overturned bucket, the smell of old leather and hay filling his lungs. He didn't look at the John Deere brochure Leo had left on the kitchen table. He looked at his father's ledgers. The ledgers were thick, cloth-bound books. Abram had recorded everything. The date of the first frost for every year since 1926. The yield per acre for every field. The price of barley in Anchorage. The cost of a new plowshare. The name of the bull he borrowed from a neighbor. But there was another set of entries in the back of each book. It was a record of the horses, their names, their birth dates, their temperament. A note from 1938. Bess is favoring her left foreleg. Poultice of comfrey and clay. A note from 1947. Lost Duke today. Best pulling horse I ever had. He never quit on a rock. The last entry was from 1951, the year Abram sold his last team of Belgians and bought the case tractor. The entry was short. "The fields are quiet now." Silas saw the pattern. In the years with the horses, the ledger showed steady, if not spectacular, yields. The costs were low. Oats, hay, the occasional vet bill. After 1951, the ledger told a different story. The costs began to climb. Diesel fuel, hydraulic fluid. A new set of tires in 1962 that cost more than Abram had paid for his first 2 horses. A new engine block in 1971. The story was one of growing dependence. The farm was becoming a colony of distant corporations. On the 29th day, Silas drove his old pickup into Palmer. He didn't go to the John Deere dealership. He went to the bank. He stood before the bank manager, a man named Henderson who wore a tie that was too tight. "Silas, good to see you. Frank Miller said you might be coming in about that loan." "I'm here to close an account," Silas said. He passed the savings book across the polished desk. Henderson frowned. "You're closing it, all of it?" "In cash," Silas said. "50s and 100s. Henderson counted the money twice, on a machine that whirred and clicked. He slid $42,300 across the counter in thick paper bands. He made Silas sign a form. "Are you sure about this, Silas?" An investment in new equipment would be a much wiser. Silas took the money, folded it into a canvas bag, and walked out. He didn't explain. The next morning he was gone. He left a note for Leo on the table. "Feed the chickens. Back in a week." He drove east toward the sunrise. He drove out of Alaska through the Yukon into British Columbia, and then down into Alberta and Montana. He wasn't looking at the scenery. He was looking for signs on fence posts, for hand-painted notices in the windows of small-town feed stores. He was looking for farm auctions. He was looking for horses. He attended 7 auctions in 6 days. He stood at the back of the crowds, a quiet man in overalls holding his canvas bag. He watched the animals, not the auctioneer. He looked at their feet, the width of their chests, the intelligence in their eyes. He was looking for the old bloodlines, the ones that hadn't been bred for show but for work. He bought a team of gray Percherons outside of High River. He bought a massive pair of roan Belgians from an old Hutterite man who wept as they were led away. He bought Clydesdales, Shires, and Suffolk Punches. He bought them in pairs, in teams of 4. He waited for the animals that other buyers overlooked, the ones that were a little older, a little scarred from years in the harness, but had what he called honest muscle. He spent $38,000. He spent another $2,100 on harnesses, collars, and singletries. He arranged for transport with a livestock hauler for another $1,200. When the hauler, a man named Gus, saw the size of the order, he whistled. 32 draft horses? Headed for Alaska. What in God's name are you starting up there, a historical reenactment? Silas just pointed to the loading ramp. On his way back home, he stopped at a small farm in the Fraser Valley. The farmer was in his 80s and was selling off his last 3 horses, a family of Belgians, a mare, a stallion, and their 2-year-old colt. Silas bought all 3 for the remaining $250 in his bag. He now had 35. When the 2 massive livestock trucks rumbled up the gravel driveway a week later, Leo and half the valley were there to watch. The news had traveled fast. Silas Blackwood had taken his inheritance and blown it on a living museum. Frank Miller was there too. He stood with his arms crossed, a look of pity on his face. The ramps came down, and the horses emerged, blinking in the strange northern light. They were mountains of muscle, their hooves the size of dinner plates. They filled the corral, their breath steaming in the cool air. The crowd was silent. It was an awe-inspiring sight, but it was the awe one feels for something beautiful and extinct, like a dinosaur skeleton. A neighbor, a dairy farmer named Bill Jensen. He shook his head. Silas, they're beautiful. But you can't run a farm with them. Not anymore. It's 1978. Frank Miller walked over. He kept his voice low, respectful. Silas, it's not too late. I can still get you that tractor. We can call this a hobby. We can find a buyer for these animals. Probably get you most of your money back. Silas was walking among the horses, running his hands over their flanks. He stopped at the big Percheron gelding and looked at Frank. The horse is the engine, the land is the fuel. He pays me back in fertilizer. What does your tractor pay me back in? Frank had no answer for that. He just shook his head and walked back to his truck. The laughter started after he left. It wasn't mean-spirited. Not at first. It was the laughter of sensible men who saw a neighbor do something so profoundly illogical it bordered on madness. The story became a local legend overnight. Silas and his 35 plow horses. It was a joke told at the diner, cautionary tale for young farmers seeking a loan. Let me tell you about the work, because the work was the only answer Silas ever gave. That first year was brutal. He and Leo were up before sunrise every day. Feeding and watering 35 horses took 2 hours. Harnessing a team of 6 took another hour. They were slow. The sound of the farm changed. The roar of the diesel engine was replaced by the jingle of trace chains, the creak of leather, and Silas's low commands to the horses. Gee, Dan. Haw, Bess. His neighbors would drive by on the road, their new air-conditioned tractors kicking up dust, and they would wave. It was a friendly wave, but it was tinged with pity. Silas was a relic, a man farming in the wrong century. His fields that first spring were planted 2 weeks later than everyone else's. The mockery became less gentle. People said he was dishonoring his father's memory, running the farm into the ground out of stubborn pride. Frank Miller visited twice that summer. The first time, he brought a brochure for a smaller, more affordable tractor, a 150-horsepower model. A compromise, Silas. But let this machine do the heavy lifting. Silas thanked him and used the brochure to help light the fire in the wood stove that night. The second time, Frank came in late August. The barley on the neighboring farms was tall and golden, nearly ready for harvest. Silas's fields were green and a month behind. The yield was clearly going to be lower. "Not here to sell you anything, Silas," Frank said, his voice genuine with concern. "I'm here as a friend. People are worried. The bank is worried. You're not going to make your property tax payment this year. Let me help you. We can arrange a short-term loan, get you back on your feet." "The taxes will be paid," Silas said. He was mending a fence, his movements slow and deliberate. "How? Your yield is going to be 30% down, maybe more." Silas squinted at the sky. He pointed to a line of dark clouds gathering over the mountains. He said, "It's going to rain early this year, a wet harvest." Frank looked at the sky. It was clear blue. He checked his watch, which had a barometer function. The forecast is clear for the next 10 days. They're predicting a perfect harvest window. 2 days later, the rain started. It wasn't a shower. It was a deluge. It rained for 3 straight weeks. A cold, relentless Alaskan rain that turned the valley into a sea of mud. The modern farmers watched in horror as their perfectly ripe fields of barley and wheat became waterlogged. Their multi-ton combines, the pride of their operations, sat useless in their sheds. The few who dared to take their machines into the fields got bogged down in mud up to their axles. The harvest was a catastrophe. Millions of dollars in crops were rotting in the fields. On Silas Blackwood's farm, the barley was still green and immature. It weathered the rain. When the sun finally returned in late September, his fields were the only ones still standing. They couldn't use a combine. They used an old McCormick Deering binder, a machine from the 1932 that was pulled by a team of 4 horses. It was slow. The horses, with their wide hooves, could walk on the damp ground without sinking. They harvested their entire crop. The yield was low, just as Frank had predicted. But they lost nothing to the mud. When Silas sold his grain, the price was at a record high because of the valley-wide shortage. He paid his property taxes with a week to spare. He had $1,742 left over. It was replaced by a grudging respect. The man wasn't a fool. He was lucky. The freak weather had saved him. Next year, when the weather returned to normal, his folly would be exposed. But Silas wasn't interested in luck. He was interested in resilience. A system that can only succeed in perfect conditions, he told Leo one evening, is a broken system. The following spring, the real test began. It was a normal year. The modern farms were roaring back to life, their owners eager to make up for the previous year's losses. And Silas was about to confront the piece of land that had vexed his family for 2 generations. Let me tell you about the West Kettle. It was a 22-acre field on the far western edge of the property. It wasn't flat. It was a long, shallow depression, a remnant of a glacial lake bed. The soil was heavy with clay and littered with rocks that seemed to grow back every year. On the official survey map, it was a neat rectangle. But on the ground, it was a puzzle. The edges were a confusing mess of shale outcroppings, dense alder thickets, and marshy spots that never seemed to dry out. Abram had hated that field. The Case tractor would either get bogged down in the wet spots or break a plowshare on a hidden rock. He had tried for years to tame it, to force it into the neat rectangle on the map. He never succeeded. The field produced the lowest yield on the farm, and it cost the most in fuel and broken parts. For Frank Miller, the West Kettle was his closing argument. On a visit that May, he stood with Silas and Leo at the edge of the field. "This is what I'm talking about, Silas. This field needs power. It needs brute force to break up that clay pan, to rip out those rocks. You can't do it with those horses. They don't have the torque. The 8,630 would have this field plowed, disked, and seeded in a single day. It would turn your least profitable acre into your most profitable." "The map is wrong," Silas said, his eyes scanning the field. Frank chuckled. "The map? It's a survey map, Silas. It's a legal document. 22 acres. I've seen the plat at the county recorder's office." "The man with the chain and the transit," Silas said. "He measured where he could walk. He didn't measure the land. He measured his own path." This was the kind of talk that drove Frank crazy. It was mysticism, not farming. He saw a problem that had a clear mechanical solution. Silas saw a riddle that needed to be listened to. "Just try it, Silas," Frank said, his patience wearing thin. "Take your best team out there. You'll be lucky to plow half an acre a day. You'll probably break a harness or lame a horse." That was the challenge. And it was a public one. Frank had made his point in front of Leo and 2 other neighbors who had stopped by. On a cool morning in mid-May, Silas prepared to plow the West Kettle. The word had gone out. This was the day the old man's experiment would finally definitively fail. By 9 a.m., a dozen trucks were parked along the road. Farmers stood in small groups, their arms crossed, waiting. Frank Miller was there, his cherry-red truck parked in a place of prominence. He wasn't gloating. He looked genuinely sad, like a doctor about to watch a patient ignore his life-saving advice. Silas did not bring out one team. He brought out 6. 36 horses, harnessed together in a massive formation of power and precision. 6 teams of 6, hitched to 6 single-bottom walking plows. It was a sight that hadn't been seen in that valley for half a century. Leo and 5 other young men from neighboring farms, men who had come to scoff but were intrigued by the sheer spectacle of it, held the reins of the other plows. Silas took the lead team, a matched pair of gray Percherons named Dan and Major. He didn't walk to the center of the field and start plowing in a straight line the way a tractor would. He walked the team along the edge, near the alder thicket that everyone assumed was the boundary. He wasn't looking at the map in his head. He was watching the horses. He was feeling the ground through his boots. But mostly he was watching Dan's left ear. The big Percheron had a way of twitching his ear when the ground beneath his hooves changed, when it went from deep soil to shallow shale. It was a signal more sensitive than any ground-penetrating radar. He walked them in a long, slow arc. He murmured to them, "Easy now, boys. Feel the earth." He reached a spot where his father had always made a sharp 90-degree turn to follow the fenceline. But the horses didn't want to turn. They wanted to keep going, following a gentle, sweeping curve around a patch of ground that was covered in scrub brush and what looked like a shale deposit. Every farmer there knew that spot. It was a worthless piece of ground. You couldn't drive a tractor over it. "He's going into the shale," Bill Jensen said to the man next to him. "He's going to ruin his plow." But Silas didn't force the turn. He let the horses lead. And as the first plow, guided by his steady hand, bit into the earth, it did not screech on rock. It sank into 6 inches of the richest, blackest topsoil anyone had ever seen. It was volcanic loam, dark, moist, and perfect. A murmur went through the crowd. The patch of shale wasn't shale at all. It was a thin layer of weathered rock fragments, a skin laid over a deep deposit of soil. And the scrub brush wasn't growing on rock. It was growing on the richest part of the field. A tractor, with its weight and rigid axle, would have either spun its wheels or gotten stuck. Its driver, following a straight line from a map, would have avoided it entirely. But the horses, 36 hearts beating as one, could feel the truth of the ground beneath them. They could distinguish between a true rock ledge and a thin veneer. They walked where the soil was good. For 5 hours, Silas and his teams traced the true shape of the field. They didn't plow a rectangle. They plowed a fluid, organic shape that curved and swelled like a living thing. They followed the contours of the deep soil, guided not by a surveyor's abstract geometry, but by the collective wisdom of 35 animals connected to the earth. They unearthed a wide, crescent-shaped section of land that everyone for 50 years had dismissed as unusable wasteland. When they were done, the plowed field looked strange, its edges, but within those curves lay a vast, new territory of black, fertile soil. The crowd of farmers was silent. They were looking at something their data and their machines had told them was impossible. Frank Miller walked out into the field. He bent down and picked up a handful of the newly turned earth. He crumbled it in his fingers. He had a soil density meter in his truck, a PhD from Purdue, a binder full of data. But he had no chart for this. Leo came walking over, his face flushed with a mixture of sweat and awe. He was carrying an old surveyor's chain, a 100-foot steel tape that had been hanging in the barn. He looked at Silas. "Let's measure it," he said. They walked the new perimeter. Leo held one end of the chain, and Silas held the other. The crowd of farmers followed them. They didn't talk. They just watched the numbers on the steel tape. They measured the length, the width, at various points. They knew the original survey was 22 acres. Leo scribbled the numbers on a notepad, his hand shaking slightly. He did the math. He finally looked up, not at Silas, but at the crowd. He looked at Frank Miller. He cleared his throat. 25.14 acres. The number hung in the air. It was a simple fact, delivered without drama. It was more powerful than any argument. Silas Blackwood hadn't just plowed a field. He had found land. He had found 3.14 acres of prime virgin soil that had never been touched by a plow. Land that didn't exist on any map. Frank Miller stood for a long time looking at the field, then at the horses, as they stood quietly, their sides heaving. He walked over to Silas. He didn't offer a handshake. He said, "You told me a machine knows speed, but it doesn't know the ground." I didn't understand. Silas nodded, coiling a leather rein in his hand. "The ground knows. You just have to be quiet enough to listen." Frank didn't say another word. He walked back to his gleaming red truck, got in, and drove away. No one ever saw him at the Blackwood farm again. The aftermath was quiet, but profound. The story of the 3 hidden acres became the new legend of the valley, replacing the one about the crazy old man and his horses. The 3.14 acres of new ground, rich with decades of accumulated organic matter, produced a crop of potatoes that year that was legendary. Silas and Leo pulled over 120,000 pounds of potatoes from that section alone. At the going rate of 8 cents a pound, that one piece of forgotten land earned them nearly $10,000 in the first year, more than enough to offset the lower yields on the rest of the farm. Over the next decade, those 3 acres consistently produced 25% more than any other field in the valley. The income from that land alone paid the farm's taxes and bought all the seed and supplies they needed. The rest of the farm was pure profit. Silas never got rich in the way the bank understood it, but he was solvent. He was independent. He had no debt. In 1985, when a farm crisis pushed interest rates to 18% and foreclosed on 3 of his neighbors who had bought the biggest, newest machines, Silas Blackwood paid for a new roof on his barn in cash. The change wasn't just economic. It was philosophical. Farmers started stopping by Silas's place again, not to laugh, but to ask questions. They asked about cover crops, about horse-drawn cultivation, about the old seed varieties he had saved in glass jars in the barn. Leo became his apprentice, learning not just the mechanics of farming, but the art of observation. He learned to read the land, not just the maps. He learned that the most important tools on a farm were not always made of steel. Silas Blackwood passed away in the winter of 1993 at the age of 76. He died in his own bed, looking out the window at the snow-covered fields. He has a tractor, a small, efficient one he uses for baling hay, but the plowing, the planting, the intimate work of touching the soil, that is still done by the descendants of the 35 horses his uncle brought home from Montana. The story is not about rejecting technology. It's about the danger of letting a single way of thinking, a single metric of efficiency, blind you to other forms of knowledge. The confidence of the spare ball can be a dangerous thing. It can make you believe your map of the world is the world itself. But the world is always richer, more complex, and more mysterious than our measurements of it. True wisdom is not about having all the answers. It's about knowing which tools to use to ask the right questions. Sometimes, the most advanced instrument for understanding a piece of land is not a satellite or a soil sensor, but the twitch of a horse's ear.